One of the earlier writers that we're reading is Frank Belknap Long. Long, whose effective dates are 1901 to 1994, was the first person to write in Lovecraft's mythos other than Lovecraft himself. And that would be the Hounds of Tyndalos, which we are reading for this course. He was extremely influential to a number of writers beyond his association with Lovecraft. Long's career spanned more than 60 years. He's cited by Ray Bradbury as a great influence, Richard Matheson, who wrote I Am Legend and a number of other very good pieces, loved Long, both the man and his work. In addition to Long's association with in correspondence with every other member of what has come to be known as the Lovecraft Circle. It's very difficult to overstate how influential in some ways Frank Belknap Long was to the development of the Cthulhu mythos. The introduction of alternate elder gods such as Tyndalos, who stands behind the Hounds in the Hounds of Tyndalos, opened the door for a number of the other writers who took the mythos in very different directions, always with Lovecraft's consent and always with the understanding that this was a communal effort. However, Long almost didn't become a weird fiction writer. He went to he's a lifelong resident of New York City. He went to NYU initially for a year and a half, transferred to Columbia but left without taking a degree. In 1922, he suffered an incredible bout of appendicitis, which led to his appendix rupturing and him spending a number of months in hospital. During his recovery time, and recognizing the fact that he had almost died, and he wasn't really happy with the direction his university studies were going, he decided to simply not go back to uni and to begin a career in earnest as a freelance writer. In 1923, he sold his first story to Weird Tales. That story, The Desert Lich, we are not reading. However, if you have time and inclination, I believe it is in public domain now and is worth a read. While it's not Long's best work, it's a very good indicator of where some of the other elements that he brought into pulp horror in this period came from. Over the course of the next 40 years, he worked in the pulp magazines, as long as Astounding Stories, Weird Tales, and some of the others were up and running. He was publishing in them, and at certain points in his career he was editing the magazines, or co-editing. However, this changes over time. As you remember from the effective dates for this course that we're studying, in post-World War II, horror pulps really begin to decline. Science fiction pulps, on the other hand, take off. Long shifts influence. During the 50s and the early 60s, he wrote a lot of science fiction. Some of it's quite good, some of it not so much. The different genres in which he worked: horror, science fiction. He wrote young adult mysteries for the Ellery Queen book series. He chose to remain because that is a house publication. They're just like Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys, a number of authors writing the books under the same pseudonym. He never chose to reveal which ones he wrote, but he said he wrote at least 3 of them. He wrote poetry, some of which was very highly praised by poets. He served as an editor for both magazines and for book-length collections. He also wrote Gothic novels. Now, one would think that it would be a natural transition from writing rather lengthy weird fiction, such as the pieces that we're studying by him, into writing Gothic novels. However, his Gothic novels were pretty universally panned as being overly workmanlike, too reliant on device and not enough on characterization and the other elements that had made his short fiction so memorable and so interesting. So there's a real disconnect when he moves outside of his favorite genres. Horror, science fiction, poetry, great. Gothic novels, the critics say no. All in all, under his own name or his known pseudonyms, 29 novels, 150 independent short stories, 8 collections, not counting the 14 he edited for other people. 3 collections of his own poetry, in addition to the editing work he did for others, and the co-authored pieces which were published throughout his life. Very, very prolific. So, why long? Other than these facts, other than that he is important. Well, the 2 stories that we're reading for this class, The Hounds of Tendelos and The Space Eaters, show us a couple of very key elements of what was of interest to the audience in pulp horror in the period. The Hounds of Tendelos spends a great deal of time talking about curves and angles in space and time. This sounds a bit wonky in some ways to some of us today. However, at the time, even serious mathematicians were attempting to discover the shape of space and time. If you look at some of Einstein's work, that's exactly what he's doing. He's trying to map the indices of space and time. E equals mc squared. The theory of relativity is precisely that. It provides an arc, it provides a map on which one can plot the relativities of space, time, and locatedness. So, is space curved? Is space angled? Is it both and we simply cannot see it? He's engaging with both weird fiction and what at the time would have been considered very, very advanced mathematics and science. But he's doing so in a way that kind of shows his own personal leeriness of science. That's something we're going to see throughout the Lovecraft circle, is a number of the authors, while they're quite capable of using the jargon, of engaging with concepts, albeit sometimes in very mutated forms, almost to the man, they're leery of the direction in which modern science was taking humanity and the potential problems that it possessed. So, The Hounds of Tendelos also picks up on a number of elements which Lovecraft himself would in turn begin playing with in some of his later fiction. Again, we must remember that the authors that we're reading, it's a circle, a cycle. They see everything that they do as playing off of the work of others, and they frequently co-authored pieces or edited for each other. But the necessity for curves and linear angles and non-Euclidean geometry, which Lovecraft starts the ball rolling in The Call of Cthulhu, but it really comes to its fruition later in the cycle. The Space Eaters. One thing we have to ask ourselves when we read this piece is, what exactly are the Space Eaters? How do they work? Are they the spider thing that crawls into Henry's head? Is it something more, something beyond? Why don't the old magics work? That's a question that's particularly plagued a number of critics. However, I've included in the archives an image of the Elder Sign. This is likely what the agnostic Long was referring to when they said they made the sign with fire on the launch. Which begs the question, why does the sign fail in the apartment? Because he made the sign in darkness. T.S. Yoshi has suggested in several of his articles, which has been generally concurred with by several other scholars in the field, that fire, the cleansing, burning, and the sign are both necessary for it to work. That's something we see fairly consistently in Lovecraft and the other early works, which becomes almost codified in the Derleth pieces we're going to be reading. One of the criticisms that's frequently leveled at Derleth is he in some ways reduces the great old ones to zodiac symbols. He recasts them as a mythos dealing with earth, air, fire, and water. However, there's something primitive and universal, and that's exactly the way that Long describes the sign in The Space Eaters. It's primitive, it's pre-human, it predates all the modernist trappings which we have come to depend on to maintain our identities. So, general consensus. Why does the sign fail in the apartment? Because it's made in darkness. It is not burned into the air. But there's a number of other very pressing questions which I think we're going to get to on the discussion boards in terms of these pieces. Again, this is just a brief introduction to Long, the man, and some key items to consider as you read or revisit his work.